My name is William C. Meadows. I am a professor of anthropology and Native American Studies here at Missouri State University, Springfield, Missouri. I grew up in a fairly rural area, but I had two kind of influences. One was archaeology. You know, on our farm, anytime you worked a field, you found arrowheads and things of that nature, and my grandparents had some of those and everything. And then at a fairly young age, we made trips to North Carolina and Oklahoma, and I got involved in powwows at a fairly young age and started dancing, so I was always around that kind of influence. So I was working on my dissertation down at the University of Oklahoma. My dissertation was on Native American, what they call military societies. So these are veterans groups. They're groups that were actually around pre-Anglo contact. So they're basically, if you would think about them as like military fraternities, groups of warriors. They had similar styles of dress, dance, ceremonies that recognized their military accomplishments and things of that nature. They served as like tribal police. They policed the buffalo hunt, did a lot of things like that, different functions. So I was doing a comparison between Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache, all their men's societies and everything. In the Comanche section, I was working with a gentleman named Forrest Castavoid, who lived at Indahoma, Oklahoma. He was a headsman in one of these organizations. And while we were interviewing, it came out, he mentioned he had served in World War II. And I said, oh, you know, my grandpa and my uncle had a lot of relatives in World War II. And I said, well, what was your MOS, you know, your military occupation specialty? And he kind of chuckled and laughed. He said, well, there wasn't really one for what I did. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, almost a year before Pearl Harbor, me and 16 other Comanches were recruited. Specifically, we had to be single, you know, but we had to be fluent speakers of our language. And after basic and communications training, we were given the assignment of forming a code in Comanche that only we would know and our officer. And there was no master list of it or record keeping. It was all in our heads and everything. The problem we were having in World War I to begin with was anything that we sent in English, Germans understood perfectly, and we understood German. And of course, when you form a code based on your own language, well, again, they know how many consonants are in English, how many vowels, the patterns. So code breaking is all about patterns and everything. And so the more familiar you are. So we needed something that could be very rapid, but was also very secure. And in World War I, there were several ways they could pick up messages. They could clip into your physical wire, your line, between two units, and just overhear it as a party line. They had listening devices that were magnetic coils that would draw and pull a signal, phone or radio. And so they could sit back at distances and really just monitor the messages that way. So the idea was, okay, anything, if we formed a code based on, you know, French, Belgian, German, English, Spanish, they know those languages. The Germans are very smart people in World War I, fabulous scholars and linguists. They're going to break it very easily. So what about these natives? And so that's the situation that comes up is they're in cases where the Americans are talking on the phones and they realize things happen. Like, for example, one gentleman is asking another officer, how is it over your way this morning? It's fine. The Germans have been shelling us all morning, but it's exactly 100 meters behind us and we don't have a scratch. Well, within just a couple of minutes, that artillery was right on top of him. And so that was the clue. They're listening to every word we say. And there were other cases like that. So they met, you know, how do we do this? And it seems to be kind of independent invention. There doesn't seem to be like one idea up high and it's implemented in all these units. But oftentimes an officer that knows that there's a lot of natives in their group brought this to the attention and said, hey, you know, we have all these guys, they speak their language, and this is something the Germans aren't going to know. And so there's a group of Cherokee from North Carolina in the 30th Division, and they had been in the National Guard even before the war, and they are pulled together. And so and it works fine. They can talk in the open. The Germans can listen all they want. They're not going to get it. Why? Well, it's not an Indo-European language, so they don't know what it is, how to classify it and everything. The syntax is, the grammar and syntax is very different in some of these native languages than European languages. So the order of how they're saying things is completely foreign and everything. There's almost no written material on these languages. What little there is in anthropological stuff in the United States, and they don't have time to search all that up and everything. So a lot of these languages are only used in the local community, and there might be things like Bibles and hymnals and things like that, but not like stuff you could pull out of a major world library, you know. And then the last thing is they're not based on mathematical principles. So some codes and ciphers, for example, today we're going to say, well, A will actually represent F, and the letter B will represent Z today. So we send a scrambled lettered code, but we have a key to solve it. Or we could do the same things with numbers, you know, or letters and things of that nature. So they don't have a mathematical pattern or basis to latch onto to break it. So these are, they're unknown languages to the enemy groups, you know, and everything. And they're not even well-known languages among your typical Americans. They just know Indians have languages and everything. So that's precisely why it worked. It's totally out of their realm of knowledge, different patterns, no reference material to go to, and not mathematically based. So it's an ideal code, and literally they can just get on the phones or the radios and talk in the open, and it doesn't matter because they can listen all they want. They don't have anything to compare it to, and they can't identify it. And the more languages you get, the harder that would be. It would take a long time to break those. So there's one officer, he was in the South Pacific in New Guinea in World War II in the 158th Bushmasters Regimental Combat Team. And in his interview, he said, I had 4 tribes in my unit, and on Mondays I used Tribe 1. On Tuesday I used Tribe 2. On Wednesday I used Tribe 3. Thursday Tribe 4, and then I started the rotation over. So that's perfect. You've got 4 totally different languages from day to day. Where do you go with that? You know, so it's very simple concept, but it's absolutely genius. You know, there are 7 groups that we know of positively identified in World War I. There's likely others. It's just a matter of there's no record keeping. The reason being is that this was not a existing plan in the military. It's just something spontaneously on the field that was done as an experiment to counter the Germans' abilities to tap our messages in English, you know. So there were groups that worked in World War I, and then there was actually groups that were intentionally recruited before World War II, starting in the fall of 1940. 5 groups that were actually recruited and trained and had codes up and running before Pearl Harbor. And then there were a lot of other groups that were just used kind of de facto. If you had, they weren't code talkers per se, but if you had 3 or 5 or 7 natives who spoke the same language, they turned them into radio men and just used their everyday language, and it was just as effective. It worked. There's over 30 groups that are used between the 2 world wars. Some of those groups are different groups but speak a common language, like Lakota. And so like in World War II, there was a group, their nickname was MacArthur's Boys. There were 7 Lakotas from North and South Dakota that were pulled together and used for messages, and he used them himself sometimes for secure messages. They came from different reservations, but they all spoke dialects of the exact same language, so they could talk amongst themselves, and it wouldn't be much different than some of us having different accents from different parts of the United States, you know. So it's a single language, but really dialects. And then in other cases, there are languages that, you know, completely unrelated, different language families and things. But there were probably at least, I'm going to say, 20 or more different languages that were used. We've all had enough, I think, history to know that there's a terrible track record there of treatment from the United States government, military and things. So on one hand, that these guys are still willing to join the armed forces, and whether their intention is their people first versus the United States second, but to still serve and protect the country and everything, that I think speaks volumes. You know, the importance of the most people prefer the term, even today, prefer the term warrior over veteran in the Native communities. But to still serve as a warrior and protect your people is paramount to many of the cultures, not all of them, but many of them. The second thing I think is that, and this is the ironic part, all these guys, World War I and II, almost all of them went through government-run boarding schools. So the boarding schools were designed with an assimilation model in that the government doesn't embrace or encourage the retention of native knowledge or language. We're going to replace it with English and make you monocultural and blend in. And so these young men in school were resilient enough to hang on to their languages, and then when the war comes, they're asked to use them. To me, they're gracious enough not to bat an eyelid. Absolutely, we'll do it, you know. And so they're unique in that they have a skill that nobody else has. There's lots of languages in the American Army, but all the European languages the Germans already know, and of course Asian languages the Japanese will know, etc. So they have languages that are kind of off the radar, off the books, if you will, and serve perfectly as a code because they're unknown to those other populations. And I think that that speaks volumes.